Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. In the last video, we set up tests and debugging within the NX project that we have here. In this video, we'll be setting up Docker and Tilt for local development, so we can easily work with a local database. This will allow us to start working with Prisma in the next couple of videos. Now, of course, you could set up Prisma and just work with a local Postgres database that you have on your machine, but I prefer to use Docker-compose and Tilt for this because we can spin up the database and it can live within the container, and any data you add to it will live within the container and you can spin it down, no problem. I was using Golang in the last couple of tutorials, but I've switched to WebStorm to show that you can use both for TS projects. So let's get started. So the first thing I'm going to do is create a Dockerfile. So because we're working within the NX workspace, I'm just going to put that at the top level. Dockerfile, cool. Oh, I'm going to move that. So what we want to do is first set up the base image that we're going to be using. So we want node 20 with bullseye, and we want to set up a database URL argument, and we want to use that as the environment variable. Next, we want to use the work directory app, and we want to run npm install pnpm because that's what we want to use within the image. And then we want to copy the package.json in the lock file. Next, we want to run pnpm install. And we want to copy the code over. We want to essentially delete the NX file. I'll set it up as a docker ignore. So I want to ignore the NX directory. Cool. So we don't have to actually delete it from the Docker file. And then I want to expose port 3000. And finally, I want to run this command. Actually, it's going to be nx serve general API, close enough. And I think that should do it. So first we want to grab the base image. We want to set up the arguments. The workdir/app will be our working directory. And then pnpm, when install that, copy this over, pnpm install, copy the code and expose port 3000. That should be it. We'll see. Cool. So that all looks good. Now let's set up the Docker image, Docker compose file, sorry. So within the Docker compose file, we want to set up a network, and we're going to say, call it general API, or let's just call it backend. And within that, we want to set the driver to bridge. Of course, with this, I'm anticipating that you have Docker and Docker Compose set up on your machine. So within the services, we want to target general API, and that looks mostly right. So we want the context to be yes, and the Dockerfile is that. That all looks good. The ports, this needs to come from the environment variable, which we will set up in nfile just in a bit. And I want to actually make that a string. And I'm going to do port, and I'm going to do port. So that will come from the actual M file. And we have the network set to backend and environment variables. I don't want to use that. Instead, I want to use an M file. There we go. And specify that. So that all looks good for general API. And let's do the DB, which is our database. I'm going to use latest, restart always, and I'm going to pass in the environment values. And in this case, I'm going to do this, DB port, set it up, and set the networks to be backend. So that looks all good. So the idea is if you want to set up a front end network, you could do that as well. But in this case, we have these two within the backend network. So that all looks good. I also want to add a depends on as well, because I want to make sure that the general API starts up after the database has started. So that's all good. Cool. So now I think I should be able to just run what we have. So Docker compose up. Oh, I forgot the env. So with the M file, what we needed was the port. So the port set to 3000. That should be mostly right. So we have the database port. We also need the database user, or well, Postgres user, Postgres password, Postgres DB. That all looks good. I believe that matches up. Now, obviously, we can choose some password. Of course, you wouldn't do this in your actual production database. This is just showing an example of how you do it locally. And then we have Postgres DB set to Postgres, and that looks all good. Cool. So now I should be able to just run that, and everything should start up. Okay, it's building, and there we go. So I should be able to go here, and we have Hello API going. And if I remember, we could see we have the actual database running in the background. So that's awesome. So I'm going to kill that actually. So I'm going to use something called tilt. If you're not familiar, tilt is essentially how you can run multiple services locally. So it's microservice deployment local. So essentially you can use a Docker Compose file to spin up all your instances. In this case, I have a database and an API, but you can imagine if you had multiple APIs and multiple UIs, you want to spin those things up individually. So that's the main thing. If I come over to the documentation, if you want to install it, this is how you go through the process. If you're on Mac, you can just go to brew and you should be able to just run tilt, brew, install tilt, and you should have it good to go. Another note is the editor support. So if you're on VS Code, just install the extension. If you're on JetBrains, you want to follow this process. So you go in here, download the zip file, unzip it, and then come over here to your preferences, TextMate bundles. You should just be able to search it and it should come up. There we go. And you should just click on that, and then you'll be able to select the actual download that you just made. And then you will have the syntax highlighting, which is nice. So let's create the file. So within the actual file, what I want to do is first watch for changes to the M file. And the reason why I want to do this is because if we change something with the M file, then we want the entire service, all the services we have defined in Docker Compose to change. Next, I want to actually load in the .env extension. And I'm going to do not that, just this. And then I want to set up the Docker Compose. So just point to where the Docker Compose file is. That's it. I believe that's the name. Yep. Next, we want to read the actual Docker Compose. Maybe not that. We want to read YAML. And then we want to get the services. So all the services that are defined, and it's going to be YAML.get services. Oops. So these are the services. And then for every service in there, we want to grab the depends on. So we just want to call DC resource, if I can type, name, and then resource dependencies. And we want to say resource services dot get name dot get depends on. So we're just grabbing the depends on to make sure we're respecting that in the actual tilt file. Cool. So if I run tilt up, how about tilt down? I think I was running something before. Okay, so I'm getting an error saying that tilt was running before. I think I had it running in the background there. And I also have a bug in my code. I think I need to specify this. This is essentially default to an empty string or an empty array. And if I run tilt down, there we go. Now that's not longer running. If I run tilt up. Okay, so you shouldn't be getting this on your end. I think it was just because I was running tilt behind the scenes. So I'm just going to run tilt up, and there we go. That's what you should see. So when you go into the actual UI, you can see we have these services. So the database and general API. You don't need to worry about this. If I click into that, you can see we have the DB running. So it's very similar to what we had when we just used Docker Compose. And we have general API running. So it's up. So if I go to the actual URL, there we go. We have the API running. Now, obviously, we don't have a connection between the API and the database yet in terms of actually connecting to the database via the API, but we have it set up in Docker Compose. So that should be all good on that front. Now, what I like to do is with the general API or with the NestJS API, I disable it from the actual tilt file. And then I come over to the terminal and then I run the actual application manually. So I can basically get the hot reload. It reloads a little bit quicker. So if I go app controller and I make a change, if I just add some comment, that should get our data back a little bit faster. So it doesn't have to rebuild the entire image. But what I actually do is I just run the debugger like I showed in the previous video. And then I can just, put breakpoints in my code. So that way I have the connection to the database that's running within a Docker image or Docker container. And then I can debug the backend API directly. And so I don't have data being saved into a local Postgres instance. It's just within the container, and then I can just stop the container, delete it, and do what I need to. Another thing is, like in the next video, you'll see that I set up a Prisma seed file, which will live in the actual API, and then I can call that via the terminal locally, and then changes will be made within the database. And if I want to, I can just recreate the container, the actual Postgres image, and get rid of the volumes. And then, I could start with a clean database essentially. So we'll see that in the next couple of videos. So in the next video, what we'll be going over is how to set up Prisma, which is an ORM, and we'll set it up to connect to the database that we set up using Docker. And then we'll set up a seed file so we can add some data to that database.